Good morning and welcome to this latest edition of chats.eu. For the benefit of those who have not joined us previously, this is a series of interviews which we are organizing as a Europe Direct core platform, where we discuss issues of a European dimension, which, however, have an impact on the daily lives of individuals. And today we are discussing a topic which is extremely close to my heart, which is the topic of human rights, but more than that, human rights within business. So business and human rights. And joining me today, I have Dr. Carla Camilleri. Good morning, Carla.
Good morning.
One of the experts locally, I may say now, in relation to human rights. So maybe Carla, you tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you do.
Yes, hi, I'm Carla Camilleri. Good morning, everyone. I work in a human rights organization called Aditus Foundation. I'm a lawyer by profession. And Aditus Foundation focuses on monitoring and reporting on the human rights situation in Malta. So it's quite a broad mandate that we have. We do select certain sectors that we look at depending on what's going on in the country. Mm-hmm. So for example, we work a lot with migrants and asylum seekers, but also issues relating to governance and corruption and rule of law. So it's quite a broad mandate that we have. And we look at human rights from a very broad angle as well, which obviously this is why it links to this topic that you are speaking about.
That's it, because usually, Carla, when we talk about human rights, we tend to think of the fundamental rights of individuals, right? Not so much of businesses.
So kind of we look at a very narrow, or maybe people think that human rights are very narrow. So it relates to kind of it does obviously relate to the right to life, you know, the right to freedom of expression, relating to the rights of an individual. But also there are other rights relating to businesses, for example, the right for an individual to conduct business, for freedom to conduct business, and the removal of obstacles for individuals to conduct businesses. And also, for example, the obligations as well of businesses to respect fundamental rights in the broad sense as well. So the fundamental rights of their workers, you know, you have the freedom to conduct your business, but you also have the obligation to respect fundamental rights. And nowadays we're seeing more and more, including, for example, environmental rights, transparency and issues like that. So it's broadened in the modern life, you know, in modern life.
Yes, because as you're explaining now, we've seen already that there are two dimensions. So there's, on the one hand, let's say the rights of business, like the right to conduct a business, which you mentioned, which also relates to a certain extent to individuals. And then the other dimension, which is respecting the human rights of others whilst carrying out that business.
Exactly.
So, can I ask you a little bit about the first aspect? So the right to conduct a business, isn't it sort of obvious?
It could be obvious, but kind of in traditionally we look at the right to work, maybe, which is more the right to kind of work and get paid for the work you do traditionally. But it's evolved in the EU, mainly in the EU. So in the Charter of Fundamental Rights, there's the right to conduct a business, where this right has been broadened to allow or to remove obstacles for people to open an actual business and to conduct self-employment activities. So the right to have this freedom to work, basically, but within a company or a self-employment structure. So the removal of these barriers when they are unfair, because obviously there needs to be a balance. There obviously needs to be some form of regulation. So you need regulation where we're talking about banks and financial institutions. So there is that amount of regulation, but then it shouldn't be too difficult for people to open a business. For example, if we have to talk about extra or obstacles or examples of obstacles, for example, there are some countries that require that you have a bank account, in that state in order to open a business.
The situation also in Malta, correct?
Yes, which could be seen as an obstacle.
Yes, and would
Yes.
that be something that would be in breach of the fundamental rights?
Well, I think you'd have to see what the justification behind that is. So you have to see the nature of the business. So there's always a balance. So you have an assessment on why, this could be unfair.
Okay.
And in order to counteract that, in fact, there is a European directive which was also implemented into Maltese law, which obliges member states to open simple basic accounts. So they're called basic accounts for people who find it difficult to open bank accounts. So migrants, maybe people who don't have a credit history or new to Malta or homeless, for example, but have.
I was going to ask, what about ex-offenders, for example?
Exactly. So these basic accounts, you're obliged to open a basic account. So the 5 biggest banks in Malta are obliged to open these accounts, which are basically basic payment accounts where you put in your money and you can withdraw it. It doesn't include loans. So this is an interesting way that the Commission and the EU has tried to counteract the difficulty to conduct business as well for certain individuals, a certain group of individuals that have difficulty accessing normal services.
I'm going to complicate it a little bit for you, because as we speak, I'm thinking of something in relation to non-residents. I know that they find it more challenging, let's say, to open bank accounts nowadays in Malta, right?
Yes, it is extremely difficult. And to be honest, it's obviously you have to see it from as well the angle that Malta is in at the moment. So at the moment, it's kind of even more difficult for even residents, non-Maltese residents, to open a bank account. What the basic payment account obliges people, the state, to do is to open an account for people who have a document.
Okay.
But any type of document, it doesn't have to be a residence permit. It can even be what we call a asylum seeker document, for example, as long as there's some identifying document. The difficulty remains because of, I'm not an expert on financial services or money laundering, but I guess that the rules have been tightened because of the grey listing, maybe, and and the money laundering regulation.
So there is a sort of legitimate justification, right, in this context?
I would say yes. So there's a kind of, always, as usual with most rights, there's a balance. There are some absolute rights, obviously, like the right to life, but obviously there's a balance when it comes to protecting the rights of others and protecting the rights of businesses. So different sectors,
Yes, another small tangent. I think this issue of balance comes up a lot in relation to hate speech, right? Because some would argue freedom of speech, so I can say whatever I wish, but there is also the duty not to harm others.
Exactly. Okay? And and there's also the balance between fair comments, so being insulting. So being insulting doesn't necessarily mean hate speech. So you balance out, is this an insult? Or is this hate speech? Is the person, as well, there's also the balance with hate speech that the courts have developed. There's a difference between who actually says it. So if it's someone very prominent, then there's the kind of, there's a reasonable, you can foreseeably or reasonably foresee that your words will have more of an impact.
Okay, so if you, let's say, have a lot of followers, you have a bigger responsibility to be careful.
Politician, for example, the onus of proof is probably less because your intention is to speak out to an audience. You know what I mean?
So it would apply as well to, let's say, a very high-profile CEO, for example.
Yes, of course. Yes, anyone prominent who has a kind of following or, So obviously, people need to be careful about their words. But let's not stifle free speech either.
Echo the magic word balance, which is, it means so many different things to different people as well.
Exactly. But for example, I was reading about, businesses, the freedom to conduct business and this balance, when you're kind of testing. So obviously, like the healthcare of individuals or the health of individuals trumps the right to business. So if I have a product that is maybe not licensed or there are some health concerns, if your license is retracted, it doesn't mean that you're breaching the right to business.
Okay.
But if, for example, then there are very onerous licensing requirements that don't make any reasonable sense, then that could breach your rights to.
Interesting.
Yes.
Okay, so going back to this aspect now of obstacles. So we've said that there should be freedom to conduct a business, and there are some specific obstacles, and we've kind of identified a few. If I had to ask you a few more, let's say, common obstacles that can come across or do come across.
For example, there are issues with accessing finance, especially for certain groups. So the Commission feels that the problems with, and FRA, the Fundamental Rights Agency, feels that kind of the obstacles to access credit from banks can also, excessive obstacles, can also breach the freedom to conduct business. Again, as I said, obviously banks have their own procedures, and they obviously have to protect their own interests. So that again, there's a balance. But how can this be helped? For example, maybe it's not state help, but for example, in Malta, there's the Malta Microfinance, which is a company run, a financial institution run by the St. Andrew's Scots Church, and it grants microloans to migrants to help them sort of start a business or start, some form of economic activity.
So what we would call traditionally as kind of positive action kind of thing. Now we're identifying an obstacle and we're creating a sort of measure.
Exactly. I mean, it's a private measure in the sense that it came from the private sector, the NGO sector, really. But I mean, these kind of companies, I mean, there could be maybe support from the state to encourage the opening of microloans or the granting of microloans.
When we talk about microloans, Carla, usually what sort of amounts are we talking about?
These are very small microloans. I mean, a few €100, because obviously there's no. I mean, then there's the ethical consideration that you have to be careful to be sure to give a loan to someone who can pay it back.
Of course, yes.
So you can't say, okay, I'm going to give you €10,000 if you know in the foreseeable future they won't be able to pay it back.
Yes. Makes sense, and that is also a way of helping the person rather than creating yet another problem.
Exactly. And usually when they grant these microloans, there's also an advisor that helps them with a business plan. So for example, if someone wants to is a seamstress and was a seamstress in their country, they want to open their own, not company necessarily, but even self-employment activity, then they can get a microloan to buy a sewing machine and that have, projections and an accountant to help them. So it's very interesting as a concept.
Yes, and I think it's something that can really help people become independent, even people who perhaps have lost their jobs, even because of the pandemic or other reasons. So starting a little enterprise to enable them to remain self-sufficient and independent.
And the positive thing is that you'd have, in a way, you'd have more craft, more innovation, more diversity in a way in your.
It's true.
Workforce and more independence, as you're saying, and less reliance on state funding or state assistance.
I find this point on access to finance very interesting. I have been working with a number of social entrepreneurs over the last few months, and this topic obviously comes up a lot. Because in order to start a business or scale your business, sometimes we have a concept, we've tried it out, and now it's time to sort of try and grow it a little bit.
Yes.
But financing is still very, very difficult, and especially when there are no immovable assets to be able to guarantee the repayment of that loan. It seems that is the way that typically banks would grant or not grant financing. Now, the question is, when it comes to human rights, primarily it is the state who is responsible to ensure that human rights are met. But financing is often granted by a bank, which is a private entity. So how can the state come in and sort of bridge that gap?
Either by, for example, I mean, when it comes to access to finance, many times it's the youth sector that is flagged as being, so young entrepreneurs are flagged as being the most kind of vulnerable to not accessing finance. So it could be that the state would have, for example, programs to encourage entrepreneurship in order for it to grow when you're still very young. So you'd have kind of developed the business when you're still very young. Or maybe, for example, I've seen on Malta Enterprise, you would have, programs that help to access a certain amount of money for an idea. There's also Business First, which we send our clients to quite a lot. As a human rights NGO, we give legal advice to clients basically on their fundamental rights. But then once that obstacle is over and they want to access the business market, then it's kind of out of our hands, and we would send them to Business First because they give them a lot of really valid advice, and basically they sort of walk them through the steps of opening a business without making the mistakes that you would make.
Yes.
If you don't have the information, because it's quite complicated, a VAT number, tax.
It can be quite overwhelming, eh?
Yes. So I think that's where the state comes in, is the provision of information and support. Obviously, you can't force banks to give loans. I'm not a I'm not a financial guru. But obviously I think the first step was to force, in a way, to oblige banks to open these basic accounts. Granting a loan with the risks that involved, I think would be not viable. No.
I agree. I'm thinking as well about, I'm aware that there are some loans which would be, I think, guaranteed by some kind of scheme.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think there are some banks that do that.
That would be also a way to kind of enable.
Yes, where the government gives the guarantee, right, for those loans. Yes, like they do as well for housing. I know that they do it for housing, where the government assists private individuals to buy housing at a better cost, basically, at an affordable cost. So yes.
Okay, so those would be sort of the common obstacles.
Yes, but then you'd have, besides the common obstacles, so those are the general obstacles. And also there's another crucial obstacle, which I think is quite quite important in Malta, and it's the obstacle to access of businesses accessing justice, because it's...
Okay.
So that's another kind of obstacle that was really flagged, that I think really makes, really kind of rings a bell or resonates in Malta, the fact that businesses, in order to access justice, would need a certain amount of financial you need to pay a lawyer, basically, because you will not be entitled to legal aid as a business, as a company itself.
I'm going to, if I may just stop you a little bit, because even for the benefit of those who might not be familiar with the concept of accessing justice.
Okay, sorry.
What do we mean exactly by it?
Basically, if you feel, or if you own a company and you are owed money, or you I don't know, for example, the road outside your house, outside your business has been closed for 12 months, and you would like to sue the government, for example, that in order to access that, in order to address that damage or to address that action, you would have to go to court.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So the idea is that you have to file a court case with a lawyer and then spend a number of months, if not years, in court in order to address the situation. And for you as a business, if you need to work, if you need the money, if you need to be paid back, if you need to be paid damages for, I don't know, some goods that were never delivered, then it's a big risk, and it's a big damage on your company.
Okay, so the fact that, for example, court procedures sometimes take rather long, that can be seen as
a kind of obstacle on the freedom to conduct business.
It's true, in actual fact. We've seen how many businesses struggled, for example, with cash flow issues during the pandemic. So if you know you owed, I don't know, 10,000 euro, but they're never in your bank account, that can make you bankrupt, no?
Yes, especially for small, small companies and multi-family businesses, that it can be a true obstacle. In fact, a lot of businesses maybe are a bit fearful to actually go down the road of court.
Cool.
So there are reports, these are European reports, not focusing on Malta, which, flag this problem with courts as being one of the obstacles, one of the general obstacles.
So it's not just a Maltese problem.
No. No. I would say it's flagged as one of the 4 problems.
Okay. Okay. And what sort of measures can be implemented to rectify to eliminate this obstacle?
Exactly. The availability maybe of alternative dispute resolution mechanisms, so out of court settlements, other measures that can be more accessible and less costly and less time consuming.
That's
basically.
Right. It's true.
So
and we do have those remedies.
Yes. In fact, I mean, there's a particular report, the Fundamental Rights Agency report on the right to conduct business. And Malta, fares quite well when it comes to this freedom because it's relatively not bureaucratic. So there are other, mechanisms. So, we don't fare too badly.
Good, at least. Where do we fare badly?
We fare badly. I think when we look at a lot of the reports, maybe on migration and the treatment of asylum seekers, detention of asylum seekers, particularly maybe also shifting from migration, maybe kind of rule of law issues, governance issues. That's where we fare less well.
Yes. Okay. Okay, so I think you made reference to 4 obstacles, Carla. I don't know if we've touched upon all of them.
The financing difficulties, accessing bank accounts, accessing justice or going to court, and also I mentioned complex procedures. But in Malta, it's not particularly complex. I would say, especially for the run-of-the-mill, non-risky companies. Obviously, then there are the complex procedures when you have regular, companies that need to be regulated.
Yes, and rightly so as well.
Rightly so. Yes. Obviously, as well, I want to point out that it's probably becoming more bureaucratic because of certain, the grey listing and certain new obligations that we might have as Malta. We have to keep in mind. But as well, those are the general options or obstacles. But then there are also obstacles for certain groups of people. So there are also specific difficulties, for example, for migrants, for youth entrepreneurs, for women, and also for persons with disability on different levels, So you find maybe that migrants would have difficulty in accessing, opening a bank account or would have difficulty in getting their qualifications recognized, in understanding the language and the systems. Youth might have difficulty, it was flagged that nowadays there are a lot of 16-year-old entrepreneurs, YouTubers who are not allowed to carry out economic activity. Although in Malta, which is differently to maybe other member states, you can request that you conduct economic activity if you're 16.
From 16 onwards, right?
Yes. So, over there as well, we're a bit more free. It's a bit more liberal. And obviously youth as well have the problem, as I mentioned, with credit, accessing credit.
Yes.
And experience. Women have the
insurance probably as well, no?
As well. It goes higher and higher for them, yes. Women have the problem with accessing kind of the balance, because it is a fact that a lot of the child caring duties still fall back on women. Or maybe they would have stopped, working in those years and then return to the workforce. So it's a bit more difficult. We do have free childcare, but it's great. But once children start school, we go back to problems because schools, schools are over by what, 2 in the afternoon, So it's extremely difficult for women to have this balance. And lastly, for persons with a disability, there's the access issue, access, physical access, and maybe access, to equipment, to actual government buildings and having a workforce or a working environment that is, catering for their needs.
Yes, a lot of these small, reasonable adjustments, we call them, which could really
make a difference.
Inclusion.
Exactly.
And this could also relate to older people who would also perhaps sort of experiencing certain impairments in later on in life, no?
And also, you know, older people who maybe would struggle to also access credit, you know, or because they would, maybe their skills are not kind of up, especially IT skills, or maybe not up to, you know, updated basically.
Yes.
So yes, there are a number of obstacles. Of course, the state can assist, and you know what you do is you assist, you give a leg up, a push up, you know, a support for these groups.
Yes. So that's why I also appreciate a lot the work that you yourself, Carla, and your whole team carry out at Attitudes, because I think you give a voice, no, to these people who might not necessarily always have a very strong voice. So, and that leads to positive outcomes. So thank you for your work.
Thank you.
Okay. I'm aware that you're busy, so I don't want to keep you for very long, but I'd like to address a little bit now the other side of the coin. So we've spoken about the rights of businesses, but then the obligations of businesses, which
has become a topic that is coming up more and more frequently, especially in recent times because of sustainable development, Green Deals, and maybe also certain reports in the news about big corporations, you know, not conducting themselves in a great way. So the idea is that when we talk about the obligations of businesses, we mean that in the way that businesses conduct their activity, they should be aware that maybe certain actions that they do, or that their suppliers or that their partners could do, might affect the rights of others, of the human rights of other people in various ways. I mean, you could say it could affect them directly if they are their employees. So kind of, we're saying workers' rights, or maybe the rights of the workers in third countries, as we've heard. Many clothing, there has been a number of scandals, you know, from clothing shops, or for example, the one in the 90s of Nike, where they had sweatshops in other countries, in third countries, to kind of make their raw material and then sell in either in the EU or in the West, basically in America, for very low prices. So you have kind of the breach of workers' rights, which is very personal. You could have, we're seeing more and more environmental issues. So the breach of environmental rights, you know, the burning or deforestation of the Amazon to, you know, have more cattle, which is then bought by, I won't mention it, by big chains to make their burgers, you know, or soybeans and the deforestation of soybeans, palm oil, you know. And that kind of affects, obviously, not only the indigenous people around who live in those areas, but also, you know, the environment globally, because of what happens in one country in the environmental sector could easily affect all the surrounding ones, and even globally. And the third one is maybe something we don't really think about that much, is the issue of corruption, and how corrupt practices in business can affect the rights of others by, for example, increasing the price of a certain either service or goods, because you would have kind of bribed or get the contract, or as well you know, land concessions, bribing to have land concessions given to you, and that's obviously detrimental to people living on it and the people around it, you know. So there are many ways in which a business can affect the fundamental rights of people that they encounter.
I think this is a great explanation, Carla, because very often we think of, you know, the traditional rights, like you mentioned, the workers' rights, or at most maybe health issues or safety
like asbestos issues and those.
But we don't think of other things which maybe tend to maybe feel more abstract, but we don't perhaps realize how they circle back to us and they're impacting us.
Because it's not particularly tangible and you can't see it. So it's not like a health right where you get sick, or a worker's right that you can see. Not that they're not important or just as bad, but issues like increasing the price of something, or knowing that this piece of land was given away because of a corrupt practice. It's not that easy to recognize and to expose in a way as well.
Yes. It gets a little bit more sophisticated and more.
Yes, and it gets a little bit more as well. You hear of journalists who report about the rainforests, who are being threatened. It's quite a dangerous business as well for them.
Yeah. So, in practice, what should a business do to avoid breaching the rights of others?
I mean, it would be ideally they would conduct their own due diligence, like human rights due diligence within the company itself, so within their policies and practices, which I assume that any big company, and I'm not saying every company, sometimes it could be quite onerous for small businesses, but big companies that have maybe suppliers from abroad, or that especially cross-border, but even in Malta, that they know where their goods are coming from. So they would conduct this kind of assessment, this human rights due diligence assessment, where you would assess, okay, what impact will my actions have? So if I do this, who will be impacted from a human rights angle? Maybe not from a financial angle, but from a human rights angle. If I build there, will I evict 10 farmers? If I buy my goods from a sweatshop in Thailand, who is it going to affect? So this is kind of, it's broader than just what I do myself, but also the business relationships that they would have with other suppliers. So like, the chain.
Yes.
The
and at the end of the day, it's also a way for those businesses to remain ethical and to protect their reputation as well, because it can backfire and quite badly if they don't. So
and also, I think nowadays, especially with the younger generation, there's a growing awareness of, okay, do I like this business? What do they do? Do they have a CSR policy? Do they use recycled materials? At least that's, I tend to do it myself,
Yes.
I check, there are some websites as well where you can check, where the materials come from, talking about clothes. Am I supporting local trade? Am I, using, it's difficult, and I know that is difficult, because at times when you have you have a business and you want to be as well financially viable. But at times to be ethical, to have, products that are recycled, maybe to have organic food, to buy Maltese produce as opposed to foreign produce might be a bit there's a financial element to it.
Yes, definitely.
But I think you could do little steps that could assist and help anyway, be transparent with your accounts, say who you support, if you donate money, I think there are various ways that you can.
Yeah, I think this is crucial what you've just said. So it doesn't have to be an overnight and sudden change, but a process where one sets their own goals for improvement over a period of time.
Even just, okay, what is my diversity policy at work? Who do I employ? Is it accessible to people with disability? Do I have, a diverse workforce? Is everyone of, Maltese, or not that there's anything wrong, but, is it all men or all women? As I said, there's nothing wrong. But sometimes it's good to take a step back and say, okay, how can I improve diversity? And why is it good? Because obviously it's always better to have different views around the table.
Proven by research that diversity brings more productivity, more efficiency, more innovation. So again, this win-win approach, I mean, you're doing something that's good for the world, but ultimately also good for your business.
Exactly. For example, like in the NGO sector, it's very female dominated, you don't find a lot of men. So it's we like having a diverse workforce, so we try to attract as well men to come in, and it's because obviously everyone has a different experience, so having people with different experiences obviously brings to light other issues that you might not have thought of, or innovative ideas that
exactly
have occurred to you.
Exactly. Amazing, Carla. Thank you so much. This has been really, really interesting. I don't know if you maybe want to share a final message before we close off.
Well, a final message, I know I know what I was saying sounds a bit idealistic, but I said, just small steps. I think both from the side of the rights of businesses and the rights of individuals, but also on the obligations of businesses. I think small steps is the way to go, and I think it just make the business community and maybe a bit more diverse and innovative.
Excellent, and we know we need that. Well done. Thank you very much.
Thanks for inviting me.
Wish you all the best, and also the people who are watching us, we extend our best wishes for the festive season. Thank you. Goodbye.
Ciao.